I am Anna de Koning. I am the Executive Director here at the Koch Institute at MIT, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our Within Sight event. We have a wonderful and packed program for the next hour or so. So if this is your first time here, I encourage you to go to our website if you're interested in learning more about what we do and what makes us unique. And without further ado, I will now introduce you to our moderator for tonight's event. He is a Nobel laureate, an MIT Institute professor. He is the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for Stand Up to Cancer and immediate past president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He is a past director of the Center for Cancer Research at MIT, which is the predecessor of the Koch Institute. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome Koch Institute faculty member and my friend, Philip Sharp.
Thanks, Anne. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see this crowd. Thank you for coming. It's great. Wonderful. I had a problem today. I had to decide whether to wear a tie or not. Now, you women in the audience think that's trivial, but to a man, it dominates the whole day. And I knew I was going to introduce Dave Baltimore here as the first speaker, and I know Dave's from California, and I haven't seen him in a tie in 3 or 4 years. So I said, I'm not going to wear a tie, but just in case he shows up, I'm going to put one in my briefcase. So I show up, and here Dave has a tie on. So I run in and get a tie. Now I asked Dave, why did he have a tie? And he said, I was thinking all day about this. And I know Tyler wears a tie all the time. So you see what occupies the brain of men, except for one other subject, which I won't discuss. So it's a pleasure tonight to host this, or be moderator for this insight session on blood, sweat, and pioneers. And we're going to start with a true pioneer, David Baltimore. David Baltimore is a pioneer on many fronts. Pioneers take risk. David is a scientist who's interested in really doing something important and new. And it has been a characteristic of his whole research throughout his career of pushing forward into territories that haven't been explored, where when you do science, you have to take risks, but you're so far ahead, you can correct your mistakes and still come out making major contributions. And I really love that about his science. Pioneers are also people who build things. They open new territories and build things. And David has been a builder throughout his career. He, at MIT, was a major force with Salvador Laureus as the leader of the Center for Cancer Research, which was established in '72, opened as a building in '74, and he was the inspiration. He brought me here to MIT. I was looking for a position, I had a national search, and I waited for 6 months for MIT to call me. And they called me, and I came up, and I interviewed. David hosted me, and I gave it 2 days later, Laureus called and said, do you want a job? And I was the worst negotiator in the world. I said, will I be on the 5th floor where Dave Baltimore's at? And he said yes, and I said, I'll take the job. Because I knew if I was in the vicinity of David, I could take care of the rest, because there was going to be great science around me and great people around me, and I clearly was not disappointed at all. To prove that, David, right after I arrived in '74, in '75, got a Nobel Prize, so we can just celebrate at the 5th floor. And as they said here at MIT, the lights never went out on the 5th floor of the Cancer Center, and that's where David spent his time here. He joined MIT in 1968. He was a grad student here and went to Rockefeller to do his PhD. He then was the inspiration behind the Center for Cancer Research as a scientific force. Shortly thereafter, in the early 80s, he moved across the street and started the Whitehead Institute. And he was a driver with Jack Whitehead in building that wonderful institute, which is a key part of MIT. He continued to do great science. He moved to Rockefeller, become president of Rockefeller, did great science while he was president of Rockefeller, came back here to MIT for several years, and then went to Caltech, where he was president of Caltech, and made major advances at Caltech. He's now the Millikan professor at Caltech. Millikan, as a scientist, as you know, measured the charge on the electron. One of the most distinguished professorships in the country, clearly a scientific pioneer who's established areas of physics. David is a scientific pioneer in many areas. He's now interested in many things. He shares an interest with me in RNA, small RNAs, but I think his most important effort now, and has been for several years, is extending immunotherapy in terms of treatment of cancer and AIDS and other diseases. It's been his major passion. He made major contributions to the HIV AIDS response in this country, led a study by the National Academy that outlined much of what was going on, major force in AIDS Vaccine Center. He's an old friend. He's a great friend. And I consider David one of this country's most distinguished scientists and one of the greatest biologists this country has produced. So it's a pleasure to have David with us tonight. David.
How do I live up to that? I think the operative word was old. In fact, pioneers are sort of those who you remember as the old founder of things. And it was the MIT Cancer Center, now this wonderful Koch Institute, that we founded back in the 1970s. But it is interesting to think about why MIT set up a cancer center in 1970. Did we have this strong background in biology, strong background in medicine that we could build on, having a specialized center to study a single disease? No. MIT built biology on the back of a sanitary engineering department, which was the founding work in biology. Actually, some quite distinguished microbiology was done there. You get the idea. And there had then been, and I don't really know this history terribly well, forays into neurobiology, some very fine neurobiology around the time of World War II and thereafter. Electron microscopy, more sort of applying engineering as it was possible in those days. But in the mid-1950s, MIT had made a significant investment in biochemistry and brought a number of really fine biochemists here. And I distinguish biochemistry from molecular biology because it was in those days distinguished from molecular biologists. Most of the original molecular biologists wanted nothing to do with anything that sounded like chemistry. And then in just before 1960, Salvador Laureus was asked to come here He actually spent a year seeing whether he wanted to as a visiting professor, and then decided that he would see if he could build a great center of molecular biology here. He got a few younger people, notably from me, Cyrus Leventhal, to come here, who only spent a few years, but made a big impact. And so in 1960, when I was graduating from college, they asked me whether I would be willing to come here in what was then a very nascent program in molecular biology. And I was very excited to do that because there were very few programs in molecular biology in the United States, anywhere in the world at that time. Laureus was a true visionary. Actually, how do I do this? We had me in Layla. We lost me. Here we are.
There we are. So you're welcome to do. No,
Just arrows. Oh, no. That's not Laureus. Where was he? Here he is. Here he is.
You can also navigate
Among the many pictures of him, I love this because it was a pose that I can remember. And it was always a pose he took when he was smiling or laughing. And he had a great sense of humor. But he was able to see over the horizon of science to what was going to happen better than anybody I've ever seen. So he brought to MIT, he was a microbiologist. He was interested in the sort of molecular biology of bacteria and of viruses. He wrote the first book in virology. But he brought here cell biology and mammalian virus work at a time when almost nobody else appreciated how important they were, and set the stage for MIT to be the center of cell biology that it became. Now, I left, as Phil mentioned, in 1961, came back as a postdoc in 63 for a year, left again, and came back in 68 as a faculty member. At that point, I was 30 years old and was joined, we set up a joint laboratory, Harvey Lodish and I. He was a little younger than I was. Those were the days. I mean, for somebody who's 20 years old, which Harvey must have been when he started as a faculty member here, to have a faculty position and to be starting on their career as an independent scientist, able to build a laboratory, get the money to do that. It's very different today. People are in training so much longer, and I think it's a shame. I think we miss a lot of creativity, but that's another story. So we started in cell biology and virology, which were by '68 a major part of the department. And then in 1970, I did what might have been the first experiment in cancer research done at MIT. And that was the experiment for which I received the Nobel Prize 5 years later. It was, for me, the first experiment I'd done in cancer research, for sure. But in thinking back, I can't imagine anybody else doing anything. Phil's shaking his head in the same direction. That would have been cancer research. And it was an experiment that answered a big question in cancer research. It had to do with how viruses work. I'm not going to go into it. But what it did was to give MIT a foot in the door in cancer research. Suddenly, because it was widely recognized in the scientific community as making a step forward, suddenly MIT was on the map. And I think partly because of our experiments and partly because of work elsewhere, Congress was convinced to start the war on cancer. And President Nixon appropriated that war on cancer away from Congress when he realized it was politically advantageous that it be called Nixon's war on cancer, and it still is. And part of the war on cancer was to set up centers of cancer research around the country. So Laureus saw there was money, and he saw that we had a foot in the door. And so he went to the president of MIT at the time, Jerry Wiesner. And Lurie and Wiesner hatched a scheme. And that scheme was to apply for a grant from the federal government to set up a basic cancer research center at MIT. Now, this was something that they really hadn't thought about in Washington, that somebody might want to set up a basic research center. All of the other centers of cancer research that were established in the beginnings of the war on cancer were at hospitals, were associated with clinical treatment of cancer. But we gave them a compelling argument for the idea that there might be contributions to cancer that would come best out of the basic research laboratory and that really didn't require patient samples and direct treatments. So we got the grant, and then it was a job to find a building to put this center in. And I remember Salva and I would wander around looking at various buildings, some in terrible shape. But there was, just across the way here, the building that's still there, had been a candy factory. This whole area was the center of candy production in America. I'd love to stand out at a spot out there, and with one nostril you got rubber and the other nostril you got candy. It was also a center of rubber manufacture. And MIT had already appropriated that building and had made most of it administrative offices, but there was a corner of it left, and Brigham's was making its chocolates in there. And so we went in and had a look, but we owned it. I mean, we, MIT, owned it. And so we went in, and I remember stealing hot chocolates off the trays as we walked around. And it was a great building. It was built like a horse. I mean, the pillars in that building are enormous, and they flare at the top and they flare at the bottom. They were planning on having really heavy manufacture in that building. But it meant we had a nice, stable building to work with. It also meant that we couldn't change the general outlay very much. And so we had to design it around the pillars. And the only pillar we couldn't design into a wall or someplace where you wouldn't see it was the one that ended up in my front office. And so we turned it into, we got some pictures from Paris and turned it into one of those Parisian, what are they called? No, not metro. The old circular advertising pillars in, Kiosk, yes, right. So we turned it into one of those. And when Jacques Monod came by, he said, "My apartment is right there." It was in one of those pictures. So that was it. Oh, no, wait a minute. The way to do this is like this. So here it is in its most unprepossessing form, the front door of the Cancer Center. It looks like a leftover of an industrial building, and it is. It looked a little better in the picture that was sent out for publicity and ended up, in this case, in the Tech. And that picture, in its original form, actually is slightly romantic and give you a sense that maybe something good is going on in there. So, as Phil said, one of the first things that happened in the Cancer Center was that I got the Nobel Prize. I was absolutely unprepared for that. In fact, I was on sabbatical in New York, and I had to get on the shuttle early in the morning to come up here because it just didn't seem right to celebrate at Rockefeller, and I was very glad that I did. And so there I was, and there's the group of us who won the Nobel Prize that year. I'm over here in case you can't recognize me. That's Howard Temin. Howard Temin and I had done, in fact, exactly the same experiment, but he had spent 10 years developing a lot of the concepts behind it. He was a true pioneer of cancer research. He died young and is, I'm afraid, being forgotten, as all of us will be, as we know. When I got an award the other day from the American Association for Cancer Research, I started off reminding them of how important Howard was. And Renato Del Becco was the third one. He always had this wonderful cherubic smile and reflective head. But he was a great man, and a great man in molecular biology first, and then later in cancer research. So it was an absolute joy, since both Howard and I had actually worked with Renato, for the three of us to be together and to get this award. The Cancer Center opened in March 1974. By that time, we had hired Phil and other people to begin to populate the Cancer Center. And so the Cancer Center really consisted of a floor of immunology that Herman Eisen came to and ran thereafter. Herman, as most of you will know, passed away end of last year and is being memorialized tomorrow. Most appropriately, he was one of the world's great human beings as well as immunologists. There was a floor of cell biology. There was a floor of virology and molecular biology, which was the fifth floor that Phil talked about. And we all do talk about it nostalgically because we had a confluence of interests, people, and a very close relationship there for many years. And the number of people that got trained from there is absolutely remarkable and fill the universities in America and around the world. And then on the first floor, there was an office for Laureus, and this picture of Laureus, which is generally the picture one sees of him, was taken there. He wore a tie. He always did, right. None of the rest of us ever did. So we made a big bet that we could make a difference in an unusual setting, drawing on the overall strength of MIT biology. Did it work? It absolutely worked. There are so many discoveries that could be talked about that came from the work in the Cancer Center. I'll mention just a couple. Bob Weinberg showed that it is mutations in DNA that are responsible for transforming cells from normal cells to cancer cells. Nothing could be more fundamental than that. And I'll say it here, he should have shared the Nobel Prize for that. Phil's discovery of splicing just created a whole area. It didn't create. It drew our attention to a whole area of molecular biology in higher cells that we had no idea was there. It was one of those discoveries where people all over the world said, "Oh, God, I almost had that." They had the data in front of them, but they never really understood what that data was about. And Phil's, I'm sure, heard that story more times than he'd like to think about. But he was there first, and there's no question. I think I have, oh, that's me. That's sort of characteristic of the style in the Cancer Center, definitely without ties. And that's Phil, and you can tell that this is the talk he was giving after he was announced as winning the Nobel Prize because of the champagne bottle over there. And a discovery that's worth spending just a minute on was one that came out of my laboratory, and it was this discovery of the transforming principle, the cancer-inducing principle of a virus called the Abelson mouse leukemia virus. And we found that it had a very particular biochemical characteristic. It was a tyrosine-specific protein kinase. Such an enzyme had not been seen before. It was co-discovered by Tony Hunter in a slightly different setting. But the important point was that it gave people the idea that if you could make a drug that would bind to the kinase, and a kinase is a well-defined biochemical catalyst, then you could block cancers that use that kinase. Well, did any cancer use it? It turned out, and we didn't go at it for this reason, but were part of showing that it was true, that there's a human disease that uses that kinase, and it's chronic myelogenous leukemia. And so Novartis then had another name, but anyway, what became Novartis, set about to make chemical compounds that would block the kinase. Were successful. Some very, very devoted clinicians took these things and showed that they worked in CML, and it was the first targeted drug against cancer. Lots of cancer chemotherapy had been done before. Those of you who watched The Emperor of All Maladies or have read the book will know that much of that was badly thought out, didn't work, had never been tested. But when Gleevec came along, it said in our future there were drugs of a different order of effectiveness and specificity than we'd ever seen before. I had nothing to do with getting the drugs going, but it was certainly gratifying to know that the work we had started out with had gone that far. So the war on cancer started in 1971, and a lot of people say it was a failure. And they say it because if you look at the statistics of people dying of cancer, it is a disease that we have not made much of an impact on. That the same fraction of people who get breast cancer or get prostate cancer or get pancreatic cancer are dying of those diseases, as was true in 1970 and was true before that. But that's wrong. That is just dead wrong. The war on cancer was one of the greatest successes of the application of money to a problem that we've ever seen, because today we have a deep understanding of that disease. We don't fully know how to deal with it because it is too much like normal biology. There isn't it's not like an infectious disease where another organism is coming in and that organism has all of its own properties and you can attack it from various ways if you know it exists. We know what exists, but we don't know how to attack it yet, as well as we would like. So we still have an enormous burden of cancer, but I must say that if you look at the statistics, particularly for the last 10 years, a lot of these curves have rolled over and are starting down. I was looking to put one on, but I couldn't find one easily. And so the effect of knowing a lot about cancer is evident in the statistics, but we've got a long way to go. And one of the ways I think, and Phil mentioned it when he introduced me, one of the ways I think this is going to happen is with cancer immunotherapy, a wholly new way of attacking cancer, one we actually imagined, the community imagined, years and years ago, but we're never able to manipulate in a way that made it effective. Today we can, and we're seeing it. You read it in the headlines. It's real. It's still limited. Some diseases are responding. Many diseases we have to figure out how to get a handle on, but it's a new way of doing it. And it came out of the great advances in basic immunology that have occurred over these years. So the perception that Laureus had that this was the time to double down and to bring MIT's huge strength behind the cancer problem was absolutely correct. And we see the results of that now. The reinvigoration of that effort in this building is just a delight to see and involves a wonderful group of people. The only note of sadness is that at this moment of tremendous optimism, the investment in cancer research, the investment in basic research overall being made by the federal government is falling. And that may reverse, but it's never going to go back, I think, to what we had seen in earlier days. What's going to fill that gap? Well, either we'll do less or private philanthropy will come in and help. And I'm actually spending a lot of my time now trying to convince people that this is one of the greatest needs we have in the country today, which is to shore up the basic research effort so that it can reach its full potential and have the effect that we really need to have on cancer research. I don't know if I've spoken the right length of time or the wrong length of time, but I am very glad to have the opportunity to come here and reminisce a little bit and to meet some of you and to celebrate this great institution.